you can see he really was the Pythagoras of the prairies in some ways. I think this visual versus acoustic thing is also an example of that would be a PowerPoint presentation. You know, you have the visual side, which is the slides, and then you have the acoustic, which is me, you know, meandering on. And so you're kind of getting both aspects of it here. I heard that McLuhan is supposed to be a wonderful public speaker. Apparently his style was very spontaneous. He would kind of be going off in kind of random tangents and, you know, supposed to be really fascinating. I think that would have changed if he'd been using PowerPoint. You know, PowerPoint stops all that stuff. You know, you have to, you know, I've got 75 slides to go through here. Next one. So this Pythagorean good-evil divide was related to a broader split in Greek culture between mind and body, between virtual symbols and physical realities, between the message and the medium. So Plato took the split to its logical conclusion with his theory of form. So he said that a chair like this one is a sort of imperfect realization of the chair form, which exists on a higher abstract plane. And numbers and mathematical equations live in the world of forms, but we don't, or at least our bodies don't. We live in the real world. So what does this have to do with coins? Well, the production of coins by stamping a metal blank can be seen as the physical manifestation of this duality. It's a bit like Greek duality in your pocket. So the stamp represents the abstract world of virtual forms, while the metal represents the material body. So the stamp is forced into the material body. And the virtual number aspect of money obeys mathematical rules and exists outside of time and space, it's like in the world of forms. But the physical aspect represents material wealth, something that is owned in the real world. So these sides cannot be separated. Gold is not really money unless it has a number stamped on it, and even bitcoins are physically possessed on a hard drive. And this is shown graphically by anyone who loses their computer hard drive, which happens to have a Bitcoin wallet on it. They get very upset. Now, this sort of duality had many associations in Greek culture. So mind was associated in Greek culture with a male principle and body with a female principle. And of course, there were no female philosophers to argue against this because they weren't allowed into the schools. And the process of stamping coins resembles the Aristotelian view of procreation. The female always provides the material, the male provides that which fashions the material into shape, so like the stamp. So these money objects are very interesting properties because they have one foot in the world of number and one foot in the physical world. And they are unique in that their value is designed to be objectively fixed and stable. So if you have a coin or a note in your pocket, then the one thing, it has this number written on it. That number is not going to change. If you trade it for something else, its value might go up or down with time, like a bag of groceries. It's going to have a best by date. It's going to become worth less. But that note has a number on it, and the number lives in the world of forms. It doesn't change. And the trade of these money objects for goods or labor means that those things attain a numerical value as well, namely the price, in a process rather like contagion, just as the atoms in iron spontaneously align in a magnetic field. So when the Roman army paid their soldiers a denarius coin a day, then that gave them a certain amount of money, which kind of set prices on other things such as shelter and food and so on, provisions. So the point is, I think it's more accurate to say that money-based markets emerge from money rather than vice versa. So this idea that money has two sides, it kind of creates this virtual world. I saw this play last year in Canada called Helen Lawrence by Stan Douglas and Chris Haddock. And the experience is a little bit similar to what was going on with money. So the idea was that you had the actors and they were performing on the stage, but then they were being filmed at the same time and using blue screen technology that was put into a movie which was projected at the front of the screen. So when you saw the play, you kind of had two things going on at the same time. You had the real performers and the virtual thing on the screen at the front. So kind of toggling back and forth between them. And the thing is, the virtual one here looks more real, right? Because it's the movie. So it actually seems more real than the real thing. But at the same time, it's very fragile because you can imagine that if someone unplugged the computer, then it would just frizzle into nothing. So money is a bit like that. It seems very real, but at the same time, it's quite fragile. Okay, so money has these two sides, and their intention, just because numbers and real-world objects have very different properties. So if you look at the number side, debts correspond to negative quantities. which don't actually exist in the real world. You can have a negative balance, but you can't have a negative house or negative anything else. Similarly, numbers obey compound interest. They multiply at 5, 10, 20% a year indefinitely. There's no limit. Real objects tend not to. And actually, this property of money, of course, is a major reason for people falling into slavery or peonage, because their debts just become unmanageable. Now, this dual nature of money is mirrored also in brain structure, where the left hemisphere, which controls the right side of the body, specializes in computation. And money does seem to have a preferred side. It always points towards number. So it favors left brain function, and this has actually been shown by brain scans, prompting people to think about money and seeing which part of their brain lights up. And I think McLuhan would have been interested in this kind of thing. He wrote that the present electronic age, in its inescapable confrontation with simultaneity, presents the first serious threat to the 2,500-year dominance of the left hemisphere. So money is a very psychoactive medium, and apparently just thinking about money is enough to make you behave in a less ethical manner. So bear that in mind this evening, please. So we spoke about money objects. Now, it might seem that when you go to the grocery store and you tap your credit card, that it doesn't really seem that you're giving them an object, but in a way you are. You're giving them a virtual object. These kinds of virtual money transfers, they don't resemble the Newtonian mechanistic picture of a self-contained object, but then neither does matter, according to quantum physics. The dual nature of money objects mirrors the dual wave particle nature of subatomic particles, and it results in similarly paradoxical behavior. And I think this is one reason money is so confusing, is because it can seem very real and then sort of suddenly disappear as if it had never existed. McLuhan wrote, "I do not think that philosophers in general have yet come to terms with this declaration from quantum physics. The days of the universe's mechanism are over." And I think that certainly applies to economics. So money has these two sides, and its inherently dualistic nature is reflected in its history. You can actually kind of see it like strata in the record. And it alternates between its virtual aspect, so money is a score in a ledger, and its physical aspect, money is material wealth, with one side becoming dominant only to yield later to the other, and so on, but always retaining the essential characteristics of each. So they're always tied together. So as we've seen, early agrarian empires were dominated by virtual credit, where the value of a clay tablet lay in the inscription, not so much in the clay. The axial age saw the widespread adoption of physical coinage made from precious metals. So this is ancient Greece and Rome, and other countries as well. Similar stories going on in civilizations in China and India. The Middle Ages saw a swing back towards virtual credit. So this is partially due to shortages of precious metals. There was also the development of virtual instruments such as bills of exchange. There's a focus on ethics, a ban on usury from the church, long-range, long-term projects such as cathedrals. This was to use Aristotelian term, this would be a male virtual currency, but it was out of phase with society. There was economic status of women was rising at this time. In mathematics, you had the introduction of negative numbers, which of course was useful for calculating debts. The next transition was sort of prompted by the 1492 Spanish discovery of the New World with its massive supplies of gold and silver. So this saw money flip back to its physical side. It led to the later adoption of the gold standard. In science, you had the visual, to use McLuhan's term, mechanistic physics of Galileo and Newton. And then the most recent transition was the Nixon shock. And this began in 1971 with the introduction of virtual fiat currency. So fiat is like let there be money. You just press a button and it's there. So money supply is now generated primarily by private banks. We've had the introduction of new financial instruments such as derivatives, coincided with the women's liberation movement, and in science with the development of acoustic nonlinear dynamics, network theory, complexity, and fuzzy logic. Aristotle wrote that it is impossible for anyone to suppose that the same thing is and is not. And I think it's really this kind of binary logic which is perhaps the major reason for our confusion about money, because money is fundamentally dualistic and contains these opposing poles. It is both credit and debit. mind and matter, virtual and real, all at the same time. And the oscillations between these poles are revealed in the historical record. So money is an active bipolar medium which has helped to shape history. So how do we model its complex properties? Well, conventionally at least, the answer is that we don't. Instead, we take these two sides of money, kind of squash them together, and treat money as an inert chip, which then kind of drops out of the equations. And that's my animation. I realize that I'm in a room full of digital artists probably, so excuse that. Okay, McLuhan again. Environments are invisible. Their ground rules pervasive structure and overall patterns elude easy perception. And certainly money has become kind of part of the background for us. Economists since Adam Smith have conflated the fuzzy concept of real-world value with the precise concept of numerical price. According to Smith, the invisible hand drives prices to their correct intrinsic value. So price and value are really somehow the same thing. Now, Smith did distinguish between real and nominal prices. So to understand the real economy, monetary effects such as inflation had to be stripped out. And Jean-Baptiste Say summed this up in a statement that money is a veil. It's just something that kind of gets in the way if you want to understand the true economy. In the 19th century, neoclassical economists such as William Stanley Jevons equated value with utility, which is loosely defined as whatever makes someone happy. And their aim was to create a kind of a social physics that was explicitly inspired by Newton's rational mechanics. But to accomplish this, they had to make a large number of assumptions. So, for example, individuals and firms were assumed to act rationally to optimize their own utility. One problem is that, unlike physics, people are very different from one another. So economists got around this by focusing on the behavior of l'homme moyen, the average man. They focused on symmetrical relationships, ignored questions of power. And money just didn't play a role. And this was, as John Stuart Mill put in his Principles of Economics, which is a standard textbook for decades, there cannot, in short, be intrinsically a more insignificant thing in the economy of society than money. Of course, this is not to say that economists completely ignored the question of money, because of course they didn't. But what they tended to do is use sort of linear equations to focus on rather narrow technical aspects, such as how to balance things like the amount of money in the economy versus inflation. So according to Irving Fisher and later Milton Friedman, inflation could be controlled and tuned quite precisely by limiting the money supply. So this was useful. But really, most economics, kind of stripping all that stuff out of the way, it focused on the idea that the economy reaches a kind of an equilibrium. And this is a sort of a barter model, as Paul Samuelson said in Economics. So this was the best-selling economics textbook of all times. It's been translated into tens of languages. It's still being used. If we strip exchange down to its barest essentials and peel off the obscuring layer of money, that veil of money, we find that trade between individuals and nations largely boils down to barter. So this is where, going back to this Aristotelian picture about barter. Now in the 1960s, so general equilibrium models, so again, they're based on the idea that the economy is at some kind of an equilibrium. And these were developed to simulate what amounted to a barter economy in which money acted only as an inert medium of exchange. Unfortunately, their accuracy was essentially no better than random, so they were unable to predict things like fluctuations in gross domestic product, booms and busts and so on. And so in science, in reductionist science, sort of usually the ultimate test of a model, right, is whether it can make accurate predictions. So you would think this would be kind of a showstopper, but then in 1965, the efficient market hypothesis became a popular explanation for the inaccuracy of economic forecasts. So this kind of got around that prediction problem. And this is basically an updated version of Smith's invisible hand. It said that market prices converge correctly onto intrinsic value. So money doesn't really play a role, and price changes are just random perturbations to an optimal steady state, an optimal equilibrium. And this is why markets can't be predicted, because it's all sort of random. But you should be able to, if it is random, you should be able to calculate risk based on statistical tools such as the normal distribution. So this has similar mathematical properties as a square, and it's like normal is from the Latin from squares, in that its size is specified by a single number. This technique was used to develop all sorts of risk measures such as value at risk and Gaussian copula Black-Scholes and so on. But the basic idea of a normal distribution is that most changes are small, they're clustered around the middle there, and the chance of anything really extreme happening are practically zero. So this caught everybody in surprise in 2007 when a very, very extreme event happened and the economic system nearly collapsed. As Alan Greenspan said, the whole intellectual edifice also nearly collapsed at the same time. So why is it that these economic storms still come as a surprise? Well, I think a lot of the reason comes down to our ideas about money. And it's this idea that economic theory says there is very little to know about markets. An asset's price is the best possible measure of its fundamental value and the best predictor of future prices. And this is sort of the central fallacy of economics. So money drops out of the equations like an unneeded variable. As Stephanie Kelton has said, money, debt, and finance don't even fit into many economic models. Martin Wolf from the FT said that students are left thinking we operate in a barter system where money acts as a veil. But as we've seen, so money mediates between number and the real world, but these two things are in tension, and this feeds through to market. So price is maybe an exact number, but real world value is an inherently fuzzy, transient, and uncertain concept, and it's the gap between these two aspects, kind of incompatibility. And therefore, the behavior of money in markets is dominated by nonlinear effects, network contagion, investor psychology, power relations, and so on. Basically, all these things that we've been leaving out of mainstream economics, but are now being brought back in through areas such as complexity science, network theory, and so-called heterodox economics, areas such as behavioral economics, ecological economics, and so on. So the main thing is that money is an active medium with these sort of acoustic properties, to use McLuhan's phrase, and this is the real reason that markets are hard to predict rather than anything to do with efficiency. So money is dynamic. This is a plot of the price of gold before and after the Nixon shock. So before the Nixon shock, up until 1971, the price was just about completely stable. And this is because this is the difference between a money object and other kinds of objects. When gold was being used as a money object by central banks, its price was fixed by definition. It was defined as that. And then after the Nixon shock, it was allowed to sort of float around and do what it wanted. And so it was governed by the invisible hand, which apparently has a bad case of the shakes here. And the reason is that this can be understood by nonlinear dynamics, which says that stability is actually quite a rare feature of certain systems controlled by negative feedback. But assets are affected also by positive feedback. So the reason that you might buy gold is because investors typically get it because they think it's a good store of wealth. And when it's going up in value, it seems even better, and so they buy more, and that drives the price up even further, so there's this positive feedback effect. And until you reach a kind of a crisis point, and then the same thing happens on the way down, but in reverse. So you get this kind of characteristic boom-bust behavior. And the same kind of thing is seen in other areas, other assets, such as housing, or of course the oil price, which has been through some huge changes recently, or indeed money itself. Adair Turner notes that economic textbooks and academic papers typically describe how banks take deposits from savers and lend the money on to borrowers. But this isn't actually what happens. So when you go to a bank and you take out a mortgage, it's not like they give you this money that they have lying around from other depositors. Instead, what they do is they just press a button and make new money. And it's actually this money, which is just sort of made up, constitutes most of the money supply, and actual coins and banknotes just make up a few percent of the total, so they're not that important. And now this is a plot of the money supply in Canada, which is the blue line, and you can see that it's just been going up, and it outstrips gross domestic product, which is the black line, and it's mostly driven by household credit, so this is mostly from things like mortgages. As Turner said, the amount of money that can be created in this way is kind of unlimited. When conditions are good, asset prices increase, so the price of things like houses goes up, which boosts collateral for further loans. If your house has gone up, you can get out an even larger loan, and so on, in a positive feedback until we reach a crisis which is known as the Minsky moment, after the economist Hyman Minsky, which is not shown in this graph. Hasn't happened yet. Money is unstable. As I mentioned, risk calculations assume that they're based on this normal distribution, which is justified by the idea that price variations are small, random, and independent. But actually, price fluctuations are like earthquakes. There's lots of small tremors all the time, by the occasional large event. And this is related to Benoit Mondobro's idea of fractal statistics, and these are actually a characteristic of systems that are far from equilibrium, rather than being at equilibrium. Money is irrational. Our theory assumes that people act independently, they make rational decisions to optimize their own utility. If you look at the proofs of most of the major results, they assume things like infinite computational capacity, ability to look into the future, even the idea that each person has a perfect model of the entire economy in their head. But of course, the reality is often more like this. Our attitude towards money is kind of bipolar. We surge from optimism to extreme pessimism, especially now. I think that the world has become increasingly connected, so these effects propagate so quickly. McLuhan said, the world has become a kind of electronic brain. Unless aware of this dynamic, we shall at once move into a phase of panic terrors, exactly befitting a small world of tribal drums, total interdependence and superimposed coexistence. This painting, The Scream, sold in 2012 for $120 million, which sounds like a lot. I mean, it's a very nice painting, but I think it's sort of an example of how, values can get confused by money. Money is power. So this is a plot of 43,000 transnational companies. Those are the nodes, and then the links show the indirect and direct ownership links. And this was done by some complexity scientists at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. And one of their main findings was how asymmetric this network is. So the top, it's a little bit like with the wealth distribution thing. Here, the top 1% controls 40% of the network. And this can be very unstable because you tend not to see this kind of closely connected network in nature. They tend to be kind of broken up into sub-networks. And the reason is that when it's this closely connected, it becomes very vulnerable to one of the major nodes getting knocked out. And if you look at on the bottom right-hand side, this is Lehman Brothers. So this study was done just before Lehman went bust. And so when that node got knocked out, it just propagated through the rest of the system very quickly. Money is unlimited. There's no limits to money. It's mathematical. Unfortunately, the world is not. There's this idea of the split between the mental and the physical aspects of money. And it's mirrored or acted out on a global scale. So we maximize gross domestic product, which is a number, an abstract number, by liquidating the planet, which is the real thing. So I think we need to do this, sort of bring these together. Maybe we need a kind of a monetary yoga, which will yoke the mind and the body together in some way. Okay, so how do we bring some order into this jangled sphere? McLuhan spoke about this idea of culture lag, which is the result of trying to do today's job with yesterday's tools, yesterday's concepts. And our sort of mainstream theory is based on the idea that price equates to intrinsic value. It ignores the discrepancy, this kind of quantum uncertainty between precise number and fuzzy reality, which is the beating heart of money. These assumptions are consistent with the old dream to reduce the world to number. But the resulting model, which sees the economy as stable and self-regulating, has actually had the sort of perverse effect of making it less stable. If we think everything's stable, then it's okay, we can just leave it like that, right? And then that means it actually becomes less stable. To make progress, I think we need to acknowledge the complex nature of money, and this has implications both for economics and for the design of money itself. Okay, for economics, the main thing is that we need to switch from seeing the economy as a machine to seeing as an organism. So it's sort of Herman Daly's idea of economics as a life science. So there are lots of ideas which can be brought in from other areas of life sciences, and they are starting to come into economics now. So complex organic systems from a living cell to the economy to the Earth's atmosphere are characterized by emergent properties, which emerge from local effects, cannot be reduced to simple equations. So the idea of building big general equilibrium models and things like that doesn't really work. These systems operate at a state that's far from equilibrium rather than at equilibrium. They're dominated by network dynamics, opposing positive and negative feedback loops, and these create a kind of internal dynamic tension, and this results in inherent uncertainty. Models tend to be quite unstable. So we have these new tools that I mentioned, such as nonlinear dynamics, network theory, complexity, all of these things which are coming into economics. What about money itself? Well, money is a human invention, so we are allowed to change the rules if we want, and we have done before. And we are living through this monetary reversal. So the Nixon shock sounds like a long time ago, but these things only happen on average sort of about once a millennium. And so I think we've got this kind of culture lag thing where we're still sort of back in the gold standard era in some ways, and we haven't kind of quite made the leap. And this period of transition opens up some possibilities, and for this reason, finance is actually a very, very exciting time at the moment. There's all sorts of new ideas coming into it. So since the 1970s, our current era, fiat currencies are completely virtual. Right? You just press the button, banks. And yet appearances are maintained so that superficially they look the same as they were under the gold standard, except without the gold. So behind the US dollar, you still have the Federal Reserve, and you still have it's got vaults of gold underneath Manhattan, and Fort Knox has got its vaults of gold. But the thing is now, everything is exactly the same, except that the gold no longer plays any role. It doesn't connect with the monetary system. So there's this thing that money is in transition, but it hasn't kind of made the transition yet. It's just partway through. And you can see that in our kind of conflicted attitude towards some of the things that are going on. So for example, this idea of quantitative easing, which is sort of a typical kind of a central banking term which is deliberately chosen to be completely baffling. I don't know what non-quantitative easing would be or what is being eased, but nonetheless, governments have undertaken these risky quantitative easing programs which involve using made-up money to buy bonds from private institutions. And the idea is to sort of boost the economy in this very top-down fashion. So you put the money in at the top, and the idea is that it sort of filters through to the bottom. So why is it that we're less open to ideas such as unconditional basic income? So basic income, the idea is that instead of putting money in at the top, you put it in at the bottom. Right? Like if you have sort of a huge financial crisis, and they did actually try this in Australia, and smaller scale in other countries, you just give money directly to people at the bottom. So each person could have sort of a set amount of money, and therefore sort of boost the economy from the bottom up rather than from the top down. But sort of while we're on that question about QE and so on, why is it actually that governments need to borrow money at interest? So when when the government kind of gets into debt, they have to borrow it from somebody else and pay interest on it. But why do they have to do that? After all, it's not gold. Couldn't they just pay themselves? I mean, if they can make up money to pay private institutions, surely they could just make it up and pay themselves. I mean, why, for example, could the US government not print its own money as they did with Lincoln's greenbacks? According to Turner, there are no technical reasons to reject this option, only the fear that once we break the taboo, money finance deficits will be used on too large a scale. So, indeed, this is a problem, but also, as we've seen, there are problems with the money supply that, with our current arrangement, and this option would certainly be more direct and cheaper. So these are sort of questions that I don't actually have kind of firm answers to them, and maybe we can talk about them in the questions. But it's more just this idea that we're kind of inconsistent about money at the moment. So speaking about private banks, why is it that they still effectively control money creation? And I think this is a big one, because under the gold standard, they had a clear role, because basically the way that all got started was that the Bank of England was formed when it rescued the sovereign by lending money, by lending gold. The reason was the king was too big to fail, right? So they had to give him money to keep the show on the road. But now, it's the government that has to rescue the banks, so it's the other way around. An alternative, 100% banking, is sometimes called, has been promoted by economists including Irving Fisher, Herman Daly, and Frank Knight, who wrote, "In the abstract, it is absurd and monstrous for society to pay the commercial bank